So hopefully folks are getting the notification there that we're recording. If that's in the way at the top of your screen, you can go ahead and hit dismiss. That'll keep it recording. It'll just get that banner out of your way. So thanks everybody for coming. You have made it to the Telephone Gap Integrated Resource Project follow-up discussion on wetlands, soils, and aquatic habitat. I see that a couple people are putting who they are, where they're from, and why they're interested in this project in the chat. I appreciate that. It's just kind of a good sense of where the interests lie and all that. It helps us get to know who we all are. So thanks for doing that. And as I said, yep, we're being recorded, so just keep that in mind. A couple other things to keep in mind as we move through the evening. As we're going to start with some presentations on our end, just pretty quick. If you can, keep your microphone muted and your camera muted or turned off, so your little icons for your camera and microphone should look like they show on the screen here. We're treating this like if we had our kickoff meeting in person, we generally would have some presentations from the specialists, and then they would kind of go stand at a table or in front of a poster board or something, and there would be kind of a general time for people to mill about and go, ask for more specific information or some clarification or provide feedback on specific resources. And so again, the resources that we're chatting about tonight are soils, wetlands, and aquatic habitat. So we want to try to keep all of our conversation focused on that. We want to be constructive and respectful in between those members of the public and the Forest Service staff, and of course members of the public between each other. So we appreciate that. And then, as always with virtual meetings and things like that, if we have any technological glitches, please bear with us. And in terms of feedback or the interaction from the public, we've got two options. Option one is to use the chat box on the right. So if you're not seeing that, there's a little chat bubble icon that you see circled in yellow there. Hopefully it may be on the top or the bottom, depending on if you're on a computer or mobile. But if you hit that little icon, it should show that chat, and you'll be able to see what other people are saying and throw in some comments or questions there. If the questions are kind of real basic, we may kind of answer them on the fly, or we may kind of hold off until a Q&A section at the end. And then depending on how many questions are coming in, we may ask that they all stay in the chat so we can kind of address them one by one, or we might kind of be able to go a little less formal and kind of open the lines up, so to speak, and let people unmute themselves and ask the question verbally. And if we get to that, either throw it in the chat that you'd like to kind of unmute yourself, or use the raise your hand option. So at the top or somewhere on the screen, you should see the little icon of a smiley face holding their hand up, and you can raise your hand that way, and we'll try to keep an eye on that. So just let you know who you'll be hearing from tonight. Again, I'm John McCann. I'm the Watershed Program Manager for the Green Mountain Finger Lakes National Forest. I'm based out of the Supervisor's Office in Rutland, and I'll admit that I'm relatively new to the forest. It's been a couple of months. I started in December, but I certainly don't have the same depth of experience on the ground here as some of my counterparts do here, and probably not as much as some of the folks out from the public who are interested in this project who are here today. So this part of our project is really to help us gather information, and for me specifically, that means a lot. I'm really interested in hearing about what our stakeholders know about the area, what they're concerned about, and what they might want to see us do. We've got Jeremy Mears. I'll let him just real quick introduce himself and who he is. Oh, yep, you're on mute.
And as usual, start off muted. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jeremy Mears. I'm a district biologist for the Rochester and Middlebury Ranger Districts. And if you give me 1 second, I will pull up my slides.
Yep, Jer, we're gonna hold up on the slides, just letting you introduce yourself for now.
Okay.
And we've got Sean Langston, who's a NEPA planner and the project lead. So just kind of let him jump in and introduce himself, say who you are, where you're from, what you do on the project.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, as John mentioned, my name is Sean Langston. I'm a what's called a NEPA planner. For folks that don't know what that is, it's okay. I basically am a project coordinator. I'm also the project leader for this for the telephone gap IRP. So basically, I just sort of coordinate all aspects of the project and kind of keep it moving along. So I'm based out of Rutland. I've been on the forest for almost 2.5 years.
All right. Thanks, Sean. So what are we going to do tonight? We're going to just kind of give a quick overview of the project status. Those of you who were on the kickoff meeting probably have a decent idea of where we are with that. We'll go through a quick review of the resource conditions and possible treatments. So again, specific to soils, wetlands, and aquatic habitat. We'll have kind of a Q&A at that point. I did see that someone just had their hand up and lowered it, I think, or maybe their hand is still up. But let's see, Jeff, if you've got a quick question, go ahead and pop it in the chat for now. But if you'd like to kind of ask a question verbally, we'll kind of hold that off until that Q&A section. And then after that, we want to hear from you all. You know, what resource concerns do you have within the project area related to soils, wetlands, and aquatic habitat? And you know, are there things that you might suggest the forest try to do to address those concerns? So we'll start with a quick intro of the project status from Sean.
Yeah, thanks, John. So for the project status, where we're at now is we're still early in the planning process. We're in what we refer to as the collaboration phase, which is the reason why we're having these meetings. We had a kickoff meeting a couple weeks ago. We had our recreation and heritage focus meeting last week. We have this meeting and a couple of more coming up. So where we're at is we're working towards developing our proposal, which we refer to in NEPA language as the proposed action. We're hoping to have that ready by late fall of this year, at what time we will send our proposal out for a 30-day comment period, which we call the scoping period. And we'll receive feedback on our proposal from there. And then that will inform our analysis moving forward in the environmental assessment, which will be the analysis of the effects of our proposal on various resources within the project area. So just to reiterate, right now we're early in the process. There's no set proposal at this point. We produced a landscape assessment, which is a culmination of the last 2 years worth of inventory and survey that's happened in the project area. That's available on the project website. I'll post a link to that here in the chat in just a moment. So feel free to review that whenever you feel like you want to. So but yeah, so any potential activities we discussed tonight, I just want to make clear those are potential. We're still fine-tuning where we want this proposal to go, and that's why we're seeking public input to be a part of that process. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Sean. So yeah, we'll jump into some of the resource information. We'll start with the aquatic habitat with Jeremy Mears and his presentation.
Thanks, John. Like I said before, good afternoon. My name is Jeremy Mears. I'm the district biologist for the Rochester and Middlebury Ranger District. I'm going to present to you on aquatic habitat in the Telephone Gap IRP project area. I presented all of this material previously at our first public meeting for Telephone Gap, and we can provide you with a link to that presentation if you're interested. Where we stand today, the existing condition
Oh, Jeremy, you went on mute. Last we heard was the existing condition.
Yeah, somebody muted me. The existing condition of aquatic habitat on Forest Service land is considered to be functioning properly in the project area and for the most part has good water quality, quantity, and provides for the species that use them. Most of Vermont's streams and rivers were heavily impacted by past land use, and this area is no exception. The effects of this are still present across the landscape. However, areas in the telephone gap area have demonstrated recovery and disturbances have been limited in the recent past. Much of this owes to the fact that the relative age of forested stands in the project area is mature, generally older than 80 years. Drainages in the project area are split between 4 watersheds: the Aquatics, the Tweed, which flow to the Connecticut River, and East Creek and Furnace Brook, which flow to Champlain and the Hudson River Valley. Focusing on Forest Service land, headwater streams are the most abundant aquatic habitat in the project area. The older the age of the forest that surrounds a stream, the better it is for aquatic resources. Mature older forested stands like those seen in the project area provide cover for streams, which prevents warming, wood for aquatic habitat, and bank stability, which holds soils in place. There are also several ponds and reservoirs occurring in this area. Chittenden Reservoir and Lefferts Ponds are dominant features on the western side of the project area. Chittenden Reservoir is a popular recreation area with some challenges in terms of water quality, notably flow alteration and mercury in fish. The ponds in the project area have good water quality. 2 notable mentions are North and South Pond. These higher elevation ponds do not suffer from acidification that has impacted other high elevation ponds in the region. It's probably good to explain this a bit further. Rocks that underlie this area of the forest contain calcium. This calcium buffers the acid which was deposited as acid rain in the past. The buffering of acids helps keeps the amount of acid in the water at levels that does not damage aquatic organisms. This not only benefits the ponds, the waters that flow from these areas are also less acidic than many of the surrounding watersheds. Fish communities of flowing waters in the project area are dominated by brook trout, slimy sculpin, and other non-game species, including creek chub, common shiner, and tessellated darter. Sections of the Tweed and Aquatics rivers likely supported sea lamprey and were historically spawning grounds for Atlantic salmon. Portions of these river systems and standing waters are also stocked to support recreational fisheries by the state of Vermont. Vernal pools are also common in the project area, and we have worked with partners to identify and map these features on the landscape. This will be particularly useful when we get to project review later in the IRP process. We still have some challenges in our watersheds. Wood loading in streams across the forest and in this area is low. What I mean by wood loading is older trees falling into the water and creating complex habitats along and within stream and river channels. Wood in rivers and streams is a key habitat component for aquatic species. Wood also slows down the water, helping to reduce flood impacts lower downstream and in communities. Luckily, like I said before, much of the forest is older with an average stand age of around 100 years. When riparian, there are also some barriers to aquatic movement in this area, also known as AOP. We have identified several of these on forest land. It's not a big issue on Forest Service land, and we've also identified them off Forest Service land. We will likely pull some of those out later in the process for as particular proposed actions as we move later into the IRP process. Got muted again. So what do we have for opportunities? Preserving mature forest around streams and rivers will allow our aquatic resources to continue to recover. Generally speaking, the more forests that we can preserve in late successional around river and streams, the more resilient our downstream landscapes will be. This is also particularly important for large woody addition, reducing fragmentation. Identifying opportunities to reduce fragmentation will enhance aquatic habitats and riparian habitats. This can be accomplished by ensuring that stream buffer widths are adequate to protect natural stream processes and that some areas are avoided altogether. We also have the ability to do some stream habitat enhancement. We do not have a lot of projects in mind for this type of work. As I mentioned before, our headwater streams are functioning properly in these drainages, but there are a few opportunities to enhance stream habitat. most of these occur in drainages on the east side. In particular, Townsend Brook and the Tweed drainage is a good example of a location where we could work to slow down flows to enhance stream habitat and reduce downstream flooding. This could be something as simple as large wood additions to more complex engineered solutions. There also may be opportunities to enhance beaver habitat in riparian areas. What this would look like is pretty broad. In general, it's allowing the animals to do what they do on the landscape in areas where we're not going to have potential impacts to landowners or infrastructure. And that's really an important part, is that we want to make sure that we minimize impact to landowners and infrastructure, but allow the beavers to do what they do, which is be fantastic ecosystem engineers. And then probably the bulk of what we'll be doing for this project, due to the fact that these headwater streams are in good condition, is project review. As we move forward in the IRP process, proposed actions projects will be brought forward, and we plan to spend a lot of time doing intensive on-the-ground review of all of these things as they come forward, and make sure that we can protect both aquatic and riparian habitat. So if you have any particular concerns about specific aquatic features or questions, please reach out to me at the district and consider attending one of our field trips in the future.
Appreciate if you're being patient, and we will get around to that Q&A session momentarily. I just want to get through kind of the quick overview for soils and wetlands, and then we'll get into the more interactive part. And let's go ahead, make sure I'm starting on the right slide. So I forgot to mention earlier, we also have Serena Kosmarski with us. She is a soils tech for the forest. She's not necessarily one of the project team members, but if there are any questions tonight that are specific to soils, she may be able to help us out, or kind of help set us up to be able to get a good answer back to folks at some point in the future. And I just want to check, am I presenting? I thought my slides were up, but now I'm seeing Jeremy's kind of.
You're presenting, John. What are soils and why are they important?
Okay, thank you. There it is. Okay, it's back. So yeah, I'm assuming folks here are pretty familiar with some of these terms, right? But soils are generally kind of what's under our feet that isn't living and isn't bedrock. So it's kind of everything in between, including organic material and inorganic material, as well as the water and the spaces in between those fragments. And what are wetlands? Those portions of the landscape that are wet, right? So pretty basic, but we kind of differentiate them from aquatic habitat. That's stuff, the areas that are pretty much inundated or covered with water 100% of the time, and those areas that are a little drier or completely dry or upland. And I'm seeing a comment from somebody saying that my slides are not visible. Can I get a tech check, or some people seeing them and some people not?
Hey, John, it's Sean. I don't see them either.
Okay.
I do see them, John, so there's something weird going on.
Okay, so let me stop presenting and then start over. So I'm stopping. Yeah, and for some reason, I'm still seeing Jeremy's avatar as well. Jeremy, are you getting a kind of button on your side to present or not present?
I am not presenting currently.
That's interesting. Well, let me see if I present, if it'll take back over. I think some people might be seeing my slides and some people might be seeing Jeremy's dog still.
Well, I can see your slides now.
Okay. Anybody not seeing the slides this time?
I can see neither.
Oh, bummer.
Yeah, John, it seems to be ping-ponging back and forth between the Welcome to the Telephone Gap Integrated Resource Project initial slide and then it changes to see Jeremy's his icon. Right
Interesting.
now, I
Jeremy.
see an introductory slide.
Okay.
I'm going to leave the meeting and come back in. Hopefully that'll clear it up.
Okay, thanks. Click resume there. Are people now seeing the what are wetlands and why are they important?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thanks so much. Glad hopefully we got that sorted for the rest of the presentation. And so just to kind of combine them a little bit, wetlands and soils actually kind of overlap in a lot of the ecosystem services that they can provide in terms of carbon storage, water cycling, providing kind of the basis for land uses like recreational uses, roads, and then the basis for wildlife habitat, critical wildlife habitat, both breeding, non-breeding, kind of everything that we think of is that is good on the forest is kind of literally rooted in soils, and then wetlands are just kind of the moist version of that. So lots of wetland or lots of ecosystem services that those two resources provide. And you don't have to read everything on this slide, but I do just want to comment that even though we're working through the early parts of this NEPA process for this specific project, it is still kind of under the umbrella of our forest plan. And we do have goals and objectives within the forest plan that kind of direct us to ensure that our soils and our wetland resources kind of maintain functionality and sustainability throughout time. So what's the condition? But the soils and wetlands are generally in pretty good condition. As Jeremy mentioned, there are historic and ongoing land uses. One of the things we are particularly interested in looking at this project is some legacy roads. We know they're out there on the landscape in all kinds of places, but with some of the resources that we have available now, like LiDAR, or high resolution elevation data, we've got the ability to pick some of those landscape features out without needing to send people out and kind of scour every inch of the project area. There are wetlands out there. We know we've got hundreds of them mapped, and they range from a couple 100 feet to several hundred acres, but we know there are a lot more out there that aren't currently mapped, especially when we start to consider the vernal pools, those seasonal wetlands. There's potentially some high elevation impacts from atmospheric deposition. Some of that acidic deposition that Jeremy was talking about can kind of have a higher impact in the higher elevations than in some of the lower elevations. We do have invasive species around the project area, and this includes plants like Japanese knotweed is one that comes to mind, and then also earthworms, right? So impacting some of our soil resources. We've got climate stressors that are changing over time in terms of our precipitation patterns, temperature fluctuations, things like that. And then we do have some sensitive soils that occur throughout the project area. Sensitive soils include shallow soils, saturated soils, steep portions of the landscape, those areas where physical alteration can have kind of a larger impact than in some other areas. And so again, kind of a wordy slide here. Feel free to read as much of it as you want, but we can kind of glance through it. This is something we included in the kickoff meeting. Some possibilities for managing soils, and I consider managing to kind of fall into one of three categories: the continued learning about the resource, conserving the resource, and then restoring past or ongoing impacts to those resources. So some things we may want to learn about is what's the status of that atmospheric deposition in those higher elevations? What's the location or extent of the impacts from earthworms? We always want to stay mindful of the effectiveness of our conservation practices and restoration practices as we implement them. The Blue Ridge Fen as a specific wetland resource could potentially serve as an indicator for regional changes to similar types of habitats across New England. And then improved wetland mapping. That's something we are kind of continually working on as we find wetlands, or as we come across wetlands in our kind of day-to-day field work. We try to get them into our digital maps. Conserving kind of as a broad idea, if we approve anything as a proposed action within this overall project, we want to include protective measures for ongoing or future approved ground disturbing activities. And then thinking of restoration, I mentioned those legacy roads, and I've got an example of what that looks like on the landscape. Potentially looking at relocating ongoing or future uses away from sensitive soils or wetlands if possible. Reintroducing missing ecological components. Jeremy mentioned that we may consider supporting beaver communities or kind of emulating some of the beaver type impacts on the landscape where it makes sense. And then management of wetland plant communities that may be treating invasive plants or trying to restore some native plant communities if there's certain species or certain types of plants missing in those areas. So here's an example of what a legacy road, or what I'd call a legacy road, might look like on the landscape. This is within the project area, and this probably doesn't look too unfamiliar to folks. This is kind of a historic logging road. You can see, if you squint, right, that it's got a little bit of a change on the slope of the landscape, potentially some compaction of the soils along the bed itself, changing what kind of grows there, because you can still see that there's not much recovering in there, even though the tree canopy is closed back in over top of it. Not that you could tell because this was taken before the leaves were on. But if you go from right to left, this is kind of what the slope looks like, and you can imagine how that would influence water running across that landscape. And it just so happens that just off to the left of the photo, there's a vernal pool. And so if we're changing the way the water moves through the landscape, we may be affecting the hydrologic regime of that vernal pool, and we're changing the way the water moves through those soils themselves. So here we've got a bit of a wetland impact and a potential soils impact. And so when we're thinking about potential treatments, we could think about going in and trying to do some sort of restoration on this road to recover the soil and wetland or functions. But we would want to think about that in terms of balancing the new impact that might come along with that, right? If we were to go out and try to do something to this road for some amount of time after that, it would look like we went out and did something, and we could potentially see other impacts. So as we think about these sorts of projects, we want to balance all of that. And then to kind of contrast, here's another trail within the project area that is experiencing ongoing use. So this is a little bit steeper area. And it's kind of hard to see just with the coloration in this photo, but we've got a little bit of water running down the tread of the trail itself and taking some sediment away with it. And where does that sediment go? It goes into the next kind of low spot where water would should be crossing through that culvert, but instead it's running down the roadbed and bringing some fine sediments with it, and they're getting deposited right there. Not the worst example of this, but this is just another case where we may think about proposing something on areas like this to help manage that water a little bit more appropriately, so then we're not getting the erosion and the deposition and things like that. So that's the real kind of quick and dirty for both the aquatic habitat as well as the soils and the wetlands. So now is where we would like to hear from you. If you've got questions that we might be able to kind of help clarify or let you know what we're thinking. If you've got resource concerns within the project area, and I apologize, I didn't include a project area map, but hopefully folks are relatively familiar. And if you're not, Sean Langston might be able to give a good description, or he might be able to quickly find a map if we need it. And then if you do have resource concerns in the area, do you have suggestions about how the Green Mountain National Forest could approach potentially addressing those concerns? So with that, I will call on Jeff. His hand is still up, and if he's been holding off to wait a question or waiting to ask a question, I appreciate his patience. So Jeffrey, if you're out there and you can hear me, go ahead and take yourself off mute and let us know what you're thinking. Oh, okay, I see in the chat, Jeff, you're saying no question now. Thank you for that. And then looking through the chat, so it's just kind of comments about kind of the tech hangups there. Anybody else? Questions, comments, concerns? I see, let's see, Rachel, you've got your hand up. So let's go ahead with Rachel.
Hi. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is, Jeremy mentioned that the importance of having old trees on the edges of streams in order to have enough wood drop into the streams to create habitat and stabilize the banks and so on. So my question is, how do we know whether logging that takes place further away from these streams impacts those characteristics?
So we do temperature monitoring for streams to make sure that we're not seeing impacts. Before and after, we do pre and post monitoring. We also have BMP's best management practices that get reviewed for not every stand, but random stands on the forest. So we are looking for impacts from upstream logging situations. And that's something that we do every year. Hold on one second. So I wanted to just clarify in your question, though, are you asking what the impacts of logging are to the trees that remain on the stream edge, or what the impacts of logging are directly on the stream?
Well, I assume those are related, since the edge stream trees are critical to the stream, and neighboring trees impacting them would in turn impact the stream.
Yeah, so as part of our forest plan, we have specific standards that we have to maintain stream buffer widths around areas that we're harvesting. And at a bare minimum, it's 50 feet. And we've seen no negative outcomes from that buffer width being made. We see no impact from the logging if the logging's done according to our BMPs through those stream buffers.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I see a comment from Annette that, yeah, you pretty much saw this presentation already, and I appreciate that that's the case. The idea of going into more detail, I mean, we are only kind of working with an hour here, so we've got to still be pretty vague because, as Sean said, we're not really projecting to do anything specific just yet in relation to these resources. So there's not a lot of detail to go in on that side. And then in terms of, data that we've got, in terms of mapping or historical monitoring, I think if we went through all of that, we might bore some people to death. I get that you may be interested in that, though, given your question. So if folks can't see the chat, her follow-up question here is, we said we'd be doing pre and post project water quality monitoring. Can we please describe in more detail what that looks like? So to talk about what we're doing in other cases, we do partner with the state, and we, through a financial agreement, we're able to give them some funding, but then also provide some of our staff time to go out to kind of, not necessarily a random sampling, but a selected smaller subset of streams around the forest each year to take a look at either long-term monitoring sites for kind of general condition changes, or targeted sites that are related to management changes. And often those have been related to timber activity. So we'll try to go out for a year or 2 or 3 ahead of time before there's any sort of timber activity, to get a baseline of what that water quality is, as well as some metrics on the stream habitat. And then after the timber activity occurs, we'll go back in at least once, if not a couple times, to see if there's been a measurable change due to that approved activity. And that does include water chemistry. And I don't have off the top of my head right now what all we get with that. But if you want an example of it, I can send you a report that the state just gave us for some work that they've done over the past 2 or 3 years, as well as benthic macroinvertebrate sampling. So taking a look at basically the bugs in the stream to see what they're indicating in terms of water quality, and then some physical metrics of the stream, like pebble counts or kind of the size of the sediment on the bottom of the stream bed as an indicator of fish habitat quality and embeddedness. I think kind of if you've got larger rocks, are they kind of buried at all by finer sediments? And Jeremy may be able to speak a little bit better to some of those metrics, because then they also do fish surveys to see what the fish populations are representing. And I think we're going to be helping with some of that, some of those locations this year, but related to other projects.
Yeah, you pretty much nailed it, John. We work with the state to get to look at these sites pre and post for fish populations following their IBI monitoring protocol. It's also important to mention here that we don't have specific proposed timber activities in this area yet, so we couldn't point to specific drainages where we're going to do pre and post monitoring until we know what we have proposed as actions later on in this process. We have, you know, using the Robinson IRP as an example, that's one where we do now have pre sites as we're moving into harvest for those areas, and we'll be looking at those now, and we'll be working with DEC to find those sites for telephone gap.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I'm just kind of scrolling through the chat here because I want to try to be able to keep up with some of what's going on there. And then I think we've got some folks with their hands up. So just give me a second to scan through. Annette, I see that you said, yes, please, you'd like to receive that report. In a second, I'll go ahead and drop my email into the chat. If you could shoot me an email and just let me know that you're requesting that so that I know where to send it back to, that would make that a bit easier. And let's see.
John, it looks like our next question would be from Zach Porter.
Okay. Let's see. Could you also please share evidence that there have never been negative impacts on stream quality from timber harvests by following your BMPs, if I'm understanding Jeremy's comment correctly? So we should have that information available. I know we're working on actually trying to consolidate some of that information that's been collected over the past couple of years into some kind of concise biannual reports. But that's something we can look up for you, Zach. We should have that available, or we can at least use that when as we go into this project, you know, we can reference that in terms of any concerns related to the effectiveness of our BMPs. So I think we've got a couple folks with their hands up. So let's go to the phone line for a question or two and then come back to the chat. So Rachel, you've got a hand up. Is that from before, or do you have a new question?
Sorry, that was from before. I did type a new question in the chat, but other people are before me for sure.
Okay. And I see Zach's got a hand up. Zach, were you gonna ask a question that you also put in the chat?
Nope, different question. Thanks.
Okay, go ahead.
And thanks for the presentation. I'm curious. So you've outlined. I mean, Jeremy made a very compelling presentation about the value of you know, these uniquely mature forests, which are unusual across New England for their age and condition. And this is because of the relatively light management that has taken place on this landscape for quite some time. And as far as I can tell, the best thing that can be done for the wetlands, the soils, and the aquatic habitat overall in this site area is actually to do very little, or to focus on those restoration activities that you also highlighted, like dealing with, you know, old road prisms, you know, maybe enhancing beaver activity. It's hard to see how any you know, timber harvest in any traditional sense would help the you know, relatively excellent conditions that you all have reported on in this area. These are some of the healthiest streams and wetlands in Vermont. I'm curious, you know, about the funding sources that you are working with for these potential projects. So, for example, could the road decommissioning work and recontouring work, and could the beaver enhancement work be done independently of the timber management that is also proposed for the area. I'm aware that stewardship contracting is sometimes employed, in which case, these kind of beneficial rewilding, projects like the ones I just mentioned would be dependent on the receipts from the timber sale. But what I'm wondering is there a way to, disconnect the two so that we can move forward with these restoration projects that continue to derive all these multiple benefits from this forest, clean water, excellent habitat, et cetera, without having to do anything to risk, jeopardize the, exceptionally high quality of these mature forests. So if somebody could maybe speak to the possibility of whether or not, those portions of this project could move forward without the anticipated timber harvest activities, even if those aren't known in any kind of specific detail yet. I'd just be curious to hear more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab if I can, and then if Sean or Jeremy want to jump in. There certainly is mechanisms or possibilities for us to work on habitat or restoration projects that are completely separate from timber related activity, and that is something that we currently do. Kind of on the long term, our budgets for that sort of thing are dwindling, so we've been looking to find more and more ways to partner with outside groups that can bring in some capacity. So there's kind of matching mechanisms where we can put in a little bit of money, and then organizations like Trout Unlimited, we've got some partnership agreements with them where they kind of do some cost sharing, and they do some fish habitat work with us or for us, and that can be completely separate from timber related work. But as you mentioned, we do have those stewardship contract options as well, which I'm not as familiar with. The forest that I came from didn't have much timber, so we did a lot of livestock grazing. So I'm personally still learning more about the ways that we can employ those stewardship contracts where they make sense. But there is a little bit of capacity for us to do this sort of work outside of that as well. So Jeremy or Sean?
I think you explained it pretty well, John. Also with the caveat, I'm not an expert on stewardship contracts, but I know that that's just one way to get work done. It's certainly not the only possibility. And usually that doesn't really, at this phase where we're at in this project, the early planning phase, and even through the NEPA phase, we're not looking at stewardship contracts. That's usually comes much later after the NEPA is all finalized and you start getting into, actual timber sales and how those things work. That's my understanding of it. Like I said, I'm not an expert on it. I don't know if anyone else like Chris or anyone who's had more experience with those could maybe add more detail, but I know that, as far as, crafting the purpose and need and the proposed action for this project, we're not at the stage of looking at potential contract, stewardship or otherwise for those.
Yeah, this is Chris. I'm not going to turn my camera on because I don't have the right background on, but I'm here. The only thing that I'd add, I think John did a good job of describing it, Zach, would be the only thing I would add would be that taking that approach kind of, it sort of flies in the face of the integrated resource project model that we use, because you would be separating, as you stated, those two activities. So you're not taking that holistic approach of resource management across all the resources. You're separating them. And sometimes that's okay, and sometimes that works out. But at other times, if you separate the two things, it has a negative consequence down the road. Like you do some awesome work in one resource, and then when you go back in at another time to do awesome work on another resource, you're disrupting the work that you've already done in some way. So that's why we like to take a holistic approach, look at it all together, and make that decision at the end of the day be the best for all resources, a balanced best approach for all resources that we have. And then just a comment to Sean and John. I think that there's a couple of comments further up in the chat that we might have missed. I know that Alan just reposted one of his that he asked earlier on. And I think that Glenn might have had a comment further up in the chat about pit and mounds topography and the influences on hydrology. And you might go back up to the chat and look at those.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. I was just scrolling back up and catching those myself. Would we consider our BMPs as exemplary for any and all logging in Vermont? I don't know that I want to make that call because I haven't worked with them long enough or seen the rest of the state kind of outside of the forest at this point. But to the best of my knowledge, we follow everything that's required within the state. But then as our resource specialists work through the NEPA process, we can add additional protections or mitigations, whether it's, avoiding saturated soils, staying out of wetlands in compliance with the forest plan guidelines, timing restrictions or things like that. So I would guess we're at least as good as the rest of the state, if not a little better. And Chris, you might have a little longer term perspective on how to answer that.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. Here I am trying to be quiet and just listen to folks, but I'm getting sucked in. Yeah, so Alan, I think we follow the state AMPs as they relate to many resource practices, logging included. So we look at those, and we have our own forest plan standards and guidelines. And what we find, and what many of our partners and the state find, is that where there's some opportunity, our standards and guidelines typically will exceed what's being specified in the AMPs. So like the A1, B1 waters issue in particular, the state wants to classify, at times wants to classify our headwater streams and the waters on the Green Mountain National Forest as A1. And we don't contest that because our waters already meet that standard because of the management practices that we have in place. So yes, exemplary is a strange term to put to it. I don't want to, we're not bragging about our AMPs or BMPs, but they typically equal or exceed the state AMPs.
Thanks, Chris. And then a comment to Glenn about the lack of pit and mound microtopography. Two comments. One, I find that question very interesting because we could probably nerd out on that for a period of time. I'd be curious to know if there's any references out there about what degree of pit and mound microtopography would have existed prior to kind of historic logging, and how we might be able to look at that as a potential future condition. I will comment that in the kickoff meetings, Sean showed that we have kind of a range of management areas within the project area as a whole, or MAs, and different types of activities are allowed in some, and different types of activities are allowed in others. And there's at least some portion of our project area where continued logging is limited or non-existent, and we do have an interest in trying to get at least some of the landscape back to some of those kind of that old growth and kind of messy forest type conditions that I think would lead to the sort of pit and mound microtopography that you're referencing. We've got some surveying for vernal pools themselves on kind of an individual or grouping basis, but we don't have kind of a area wide survey of that. We do have the available LiDAR, but I don't know that that's going to be as sensitive as we would need to really be able to classify every little vernal pool. But we've got an interest in it, and we have resource specialists who want to get out there and learn more about them and make sure that we're managing those sorts of resources the best we can. I know the state of Vermont is really interested in it as well, and we're looking at partnering with them and developing some tools that allow them to do field monitoring and us to do field monitoring, and to marry those sets of data up so we can all know, kind of have the latest and greatest in terms of mapping for those sorts of features. So maybe not the exact sort of answer you're looking at, but I appreciate that question. It's an interesting thing to consider. And just a time check, it's 5:22, so we do have 8 minutes left in our scheduled time. And I personally am going to need to run at 5:30. I've got another commitment that I need to try to get to. I'm not sure if Jeremy or Sean or Chris are available to stay any later, but if you've got a question that we either don't get to in the chat or don't get to verbally, I did throw my email back in the chat. And Sean, if you want to drop yours in there as well, people can feel free to keep sending us questions or comments, and we can try to respond to you individually, or if there are questions that everybody seems to be asking, we may be able to put it on the project website as well, so that everybody else who may have that same question can find it at a centralized location. Let's see. There's a couple other chats, and there's still some hands raised. So we just did a chat question, so let's jump back. Rachel, I'm seeing your hand up again, or still. Did you want to go again?
Well, unless there's somebody else who's not had a turn yet, I did want to just get your general feedback about why this particular project in this particular place. What were the, sort of fundamental driving forces behind this decision for the telephone gap area?
I think Sean might be able to speak to that a little bit in terms of the way we rotate our IRP projects over time.
Yeah, I could maybe touch on it a little bit. Even though the selection of this particular project boundary predates when I got here, but just for a little context, since our forest plan was finalized in 2006, we have completed 6 IRPs previously. Those tend to cover fairly large landscapes by watersheds. So this was sort of the next area that we hadn't looked at yet. So that's the short answer. It was sort of we kind of, in order not to overload the staff of one ranger district with multiple IRPs in a row, because it is a lot of work, kind of go back and forth. So the last IRP we did was the Somerset IRP down in the Manchester district. So this one comes up north to the Rochester and Middlebury. Yeah, but Chris, I hate to call on you again, but I don't know if you have any more detail besides that.
Yeah, I can add just a little bit. We do try to rotate them between the 2 ranger districts to not overwhelm the district staff. But we also follow a process where we look at where is there a nexus of resource interest, opportunities for forest management, opportunities for, botanical work, non-native invasive species control, recreation resources, in some cases lands resources. This one has a fairly large land component to it. We're going to be acquiring a large piece of new land that's going to be added to the national forest that's within this project area. We just look for that nexus of resources, and we talk to the resource specialists about, what's in this project area. And in this particular project area, it was formerly, when we did the original analysis, it was identified as 2 individual IRP opportunities, but because of the size of them and their location, and they're kind of located at the southern end of the Rochester and Middlebury Ranger District, they were smaller than what we had been working with in the past. And we like to look at a larger landscape, if at all possible, to be, like I said earlier, holistic about that. So we chose this area due to this new land acquisition coming in. It had been a fair amount of time since we had been here and looked at it from a forest management perspective. There were some recreation opportunities around Chittenden Reservoir and Lefferts Pond, and with trails that we could address, and also some work on wildlife and aquatic habitats as well. So it was kind of ripe for the picking, to use a cliched statement.
All right, thanks, Chris.
Yep, and I do know that Mark Nelson had his hand up earlier, and now he's asking, may he ask a quick question? I don't know if we've gotten to him yet or not.
I don't think we have. So Mark, I apologize for that. Let's go ahead and get your question in.
Sean, no apology necessary, and thanks, because a lot of good questions here, and thanks to you and all the Forest Service staff on the meeting today. And it's a fairly short question. So it's been identified in your landscape assessment, and it was reiterated today, the importance of these mature forests for the health of aquatic habitat. And as Zach has pointed out, that, you know, mature forests are an incredibly small percentage of forests in Vermont and across New England. So with this, in mind, will these mature forest areas be off limits to any logging activities in this project?
That's a good question that I don't necessarily know the answer to, and I know that's punting a little bit. What I will say is that, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, we do have some protections in the forest plan in terms of standards and guidelines that protect some of those aquatic and wetland resources specifically, right? So we generally wouldn't approve logging right up to or within wetlands, or right up to or within the green line of a stream. We do try to maintain buffers at least, and I know that doesn't necessarily get to your entire question, because I think you're talking about the hillside functions as well as you get out further away. And I'm not familiar enough with exactly where the management area boundaries are and where the different stand age classes are. If folks, I don't know if the kind of forestry and ecology follow-up sub-meeting has occurred yet, but the habitat management unit analysis modeling that was done by our forest ecologist might touch on some of that. In terms of, you know, where we have kind of a target forest composition versus what exists versus where the trend seems to be going over time. I'm not as well versed in being able to answer that, but you may be able to get a better answer from that group. But, you know, your question, I think, is pretty indicative of a lot of the concern that's been expressed here today. And as we move forward in this process, you know, this is part of what we need to do with this NEPA process, is figure out what these concerns are, where they exist, make sure that we can address them when we talk about the potential impacts of any of these projects that we may look at approving, and whether that's looking to approve actual, you know, timber harvest in some area, or leaving timber harvest out of some area. You know, what are the impacts one way or the other? And, you know, like I said, there's a lot of interest in that here, so that definitely helps focus the work that we're going to end up doing as we look at potential projects, whether it's restoration related or recreation related or timber or whatever it might be. And I did want to comment too, Zach, I think had put in a reference for me that I asked for earlier. And anybody that was on the kickoff meeting, there were a lot of references that were shared, whether they were articles or websites or peer-reviewed, journal articles. Sean and Jay did go through everything that was shared in that chat. They pulled all those references into a single folder, and they've shared those back out with the team members and told us to go ahead and take a look at those and make sure that we are including that as we move forward with this process through the fall, right? So we're not doing it all today per se, but I just want everybody to know that when you share those pieces of information with us, you are being heard. So we're at 5:30. I imagine there might be some questions that we didn't get to. I'm not sure how best to move on with it, with kind of closing this. We did put, let's see, Sean and Jeremy put their emails in the chat. I put my email in the chat as well. So like I said, if you've got questions that didn't get answered, feel free to send them to us. That way we can make sure we get an answer for you. If you requested something from us, as I said, remind me that I need to send it to you, because in tracking all this, I'm worried that I'll forget.
Hey, John.
Yeah,
if you need to head out, I can hang around for a couple minutes. It looks like James Donahue is typing. I don't know if he might be trying to answer Mark's question a little bit. I'm not sure, but I'll kind of hang out until till he's kind of done with that, so we can kind of
Okay.
capture the recording if you got head out.
Okay,
I can
thanks.
stick
And
around
yeah,
too.
I'll just point out that Joy did put in that the Ecology, Timber, Roads, and Fuels meeting is tomorrow at 4:30. So thanks for reminding us of that. And then there is going to be another discussion about soils, wetlands, and aquatic habitats. We're planning a field trip. I think it's September 22nd. If anybody got the email notification about this meeting today, you'll be on the same outreach list when we go to schedule that field trip. And anybody else that indicates between now and then that they're interested in joining us on a field trip, we'll add them to that outreach information as well. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time and your interest. Hoping that we can put together a product that's as good as it can be for as broad an audience and to do what's right for the landscape and for the mission of the Forest Service. So on that, I'll check out and I'll keep an eye out for those emails from y'all. Thanks. Bye.
I just saw a question pop up in the chat that I'm going to answer quickly from Annette. Annette, we haven't decided where we're going for the field trip yet. So if you're on the mailing list for this meeting, which I'm assuming you are, we haven't decided it yet, and we're looking for recommendations, places people are interested in. And go ahead and contact us directly if you have something you would like to look at. Okay, well, we'll figure that out. My email's in the chat. I'll put it in again. You can contact me directly, and we'll make sure that you're kept informed of what the field trip are.
Yeah, I've heard from a couple people that they did not get the emails, even though I went back and looked at the email and I saw their address in there. So I don't know, maybe it's going to a spam folder or somehow not coming through, but something maybe we need to look into. Okay, yeah, I don't know what happened there, but do apologize.
Doesn't look like we have any hands up.
Yeah, is James still typing? Or did it seems like he was typing for a while, so I was kind of waiting for him to finish, but
All right.
so
Sean, I'm just looking through the chat now to make sure that we didn't miss anything.
This is Zach. Do you mind if I ask a question
No, please go ahead.
of you, Jeremy? I really appreciated your presentations, both at the first meeting and this meeting tonight. And, you've really, shared what a lot of the latest science, says about the value of mature forests for maintaining, stream health, from the woody debris that naturally falls to the forest floor, as well as reducing, downstream flooding risk. I work by day as the Lake Champlain Lake Keeper for the Conservation Law Foundation, and I'm dealing with the total maximum daily load that, has been developed for Lake Champlain, which is focused on phosphorus pollution. And we know that older forests do an exceptional job at removing phosphorus from streams, much better than what is possible in a, ecosystem with much less woody debris present on the floor. And so, as I hear your presentations and considering, the unique qualities of this forest in the state of Vermont, I wonder if you all will be considering a no action alternative, really seriously, or like I was saying earlier, an alternative that only focuses on the restoration components, focused on, like you were talking about before, improving beaver habitat, potentially dealing with some of those old roads. But less is more seems to be the message that I'm getting from, the, discussion about the qualities of this area. And so just wondering, if that will be something that you all spend a lot of time on, is thinking about how simply allowing this forest to operate under the influence of our changing climate, which will naturally result in more woody debris down on the forest floor, and allow this forest to grow, might be something that you all are really taking seriously as you think about what to do with the telephone gap project.
Yeah, Jeremy, I mean, as far as alternatives, yeah, at this point, I mean, I guess the quick answer is pretty much everything's on the table. We will consider that, especially the more the more comments and interest we get, especially during this collaboration phase, that all will go into developing our proposed action as well as any alternatives. And then even further, like during the scoping comment period and all that, once people get to see, our full proposal, it's on the table. For now, we're just trying not to exclude any ideas. So, I mean, if you read through the landscape assessment, there are like potential actions, but like we keep stressing, those are just, it's a list of ideas at this point. It's nothing more than that. So, but it looks like James left and he stopped typing a while ago, so I don't know. Yeah, so we'll just go ahead and call it unless there are any real quick questions. But yeah, just a reminder, everyone, the timber meeting is tomorrow at 4:30. So yeah, a lot of these questions might be better suited there. We'll have our silviculturist who can probably answer these kind of questions way better than I ever could. So yeah, I would encourage anyone to come to that. And we also know there was a lot of interest in carbon and carbon sequestration during the kickoff meeting. So we are planning on having a carbon specific meeting. It's in the works. We don't have anything set right now, but probably sometime in September is what we're looking at. And we will send out notification to everyone so they can participate. So with that, I'm going to go ahead, unless Jeremy, if you had any last comments, we'll go ahead and call it for John.
The only thing I would say is I would recommend to attend tomorrow's meeting to really listen to what James Donahue, our silviculturist, has to say. He's got a lot of great information and he spent a lot of time looking at this area, and I think it'll be very informative, coupled with the other resources that will be presented tomorrow to get an idea of where we're headed and what we're thinking about for this project area.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a good night.